To the foreman, it was just another pour before the weekend. The plans said wait 3 days. The crew said it'll hold. At 3:15 p.m., the slab shuddered. Once. By the time anyone looked up, the entire building was folding in slow motion. 5 men vanished in the dust. They didn't die from an explosion or an earthquake. They died from a decision. A shortcut that everyone took, because everyone always did. March 5th, 1981. Coconut Grove, Miami. The Harbor Cay condominium project sat on prime waterfront real estate, worth millions per acre. A luxury development promising water views and wealthy retirees. William Perez Construction had the contract. The building was 5 stories of post-tensioned concrete slabs supported by shores. Temporary supports that held each floor while the concrete cured and gained strength. The engineering was straightforward, almost routine for South Florida construction. Pour concrete on the 5th floor, wait 72 hours for it to cure to minimum strength. Remove shores from the 3rd floor below, transferring the load permanently to the structure itself. Simple sequence. Proven safe. Written in the plans. But the schedule was tight, the weather was perfect, and the crane was expensive. The decision that would kill 5 men was made sometime in the hours before the collapse, probably during a brief conversation that nobody recorded and nobody remembered clearly afterward. The exact words were never documented. What's certain is this. Someone decided to remove shores from the 3rd floor slab, while the 5th floor concrete was still wet, less than 24 hours old instead of the required 72. This wasn't negligence. It was industry practice. A calculated gamble that had worked hundreds of times before on dozens of projects across South Florida. Every superintendent knew the math. Every foreman had done it. The engineering drawings said one thing, reality on the job site said another, and reality always seemed to win, until it didn't. But what investigators would discover in the wreckage wasn't just a single bad decision, it was a system designed to kill people. And we'll see exactly how that system worked, and why it's still working today. First, though, we need to understand the technical details that made Harbor Cay a ticking time bomb. Understanding why Harbor Cay collapsed requires understanding post-tensioned concrete construction, a system that revolutionized high-rise building in the 1970s and remains standard today. But this system had a vulnerability that builders were still learning about in 1981, a weakness that turned routine construction shortcuts into death traps. Traditional reinforced concrete uses steel rebar embedded in the concrete before it's poured. The rebar provides tensile strength, resistance to pulling forces. The concrete provides compressive strength, resistance to pushing forces. Together, they create a structural system that's been proven for over a century. Post-tensioned concrete is different. Steel cables called tendons run through plastic or metal ducts cast into the concrete slab. After the concrete cures, hydraulic jacks pull these tendons tight, compressing the entire slab. This compression makes the concrete stronger, allows longer spans between columns, and reduces the amount of material needed. It's lighter, cheaper, faster to build. But there's a critical window of vulnerability. Before the tendons are stressed, before they're pulled tight, the slab has almost no tensile strength. It's just concrete with holes through it. During this period, the slab must be fully supported by temporary shores. Remove those shores too early, and you're asking an unstressed slab to carry loads it was never designed to handle on its own. This vulnerability would become crystal clear when investigators examined what was left of Harbor Cay. But the real shock wasn't the technical failure. It was discovering how many other buildings were being constructed the exact same way at that very moment. More on that shortly. The Harbor Cay design called for 8-inch thick slabs with post-tensioning tendons spaced at precise intervals. The structural engineer, James Batista and Associates, had specified a shoring plan. Third-floor shores could only be removed after the fifth-floor concrete reached a minimum compressive strength of 3,000 pounds per square inch, typically 72 hours after pouring. This waiting period wasn't arbitrary. Concrete gains strength over time as chemical reactions between cement and water form crystalline structures. At 24 hours, concrete might reach only 60 to 70% of its required strength. At 72 hours, it typically exceeds 90%. That difference matters enormously when the slab is carrying the weight of multiple floors above. 1981, crews poured the fifth-floor slab. Approximately 150 cubic yards of concrete, weighing roughly 450,000 pounds, spread across the entire floor. The concrete would need 3 days to cure. But the construction schedule was behind. The crane rental was expensive. Thousands of dollars per day. The weather forecast showed rain coming later in the week that would halt work. And most significantly, this same procedure had worked before on this very building. Shores had been pulled early on lower floors without problems. What nobody understood yet was that each successful shortcut was simply loading the dice for the inevitable failure. And when that failure came, it would expose an industry-wide practice that had been killing people quietly for years. We'll get to those other collapses soon. First, the mathematics of destruction. Construction Superintendent William Trempa made the decision, or approved it, or failed to prevent it. The exact chain of command was never fully established. What's documented is that on March 5th, less than 24 hours after the fifth-floor pour, crews began removing shores from the third-floor slab. The mathematics of what happened next were straightforward, though nobody was calculating them in real time. The third-floor slab, designed to eventually carry its own weight, plus live loads of 50 pounds per square foot, was suddenly asked to support itself, plus the fourth-floor slab above it, plus the freshly poured, uncured fifth-floor slab at the very top. The loads cascaded downward. Each slab in a multi-story building carries not just its own weight, but everything above it. By removing the third-floor shores, the builders were asking a partially cured slab to suddenly support approximately 3 times the load it was designed to carry, and doing so before the post-tensioning cables had been stressed. The structure held for hours. This is important. The collapse wasn't instantaneous. The building was failing slowly, microscopic cracks propagating through overstressed concrete, but still standing. Workers moved around the site, unaware they were walking on a structure in the process of dying. At 3:15 p.m., something gave way. The most likely failure point was the third-floor slab near column line 3, where the combination of loads and the lack of tensile strength from unstressed tendons created forces the concrete simply couldn't resist. When a flat-plate concrete structure fails, it doesn't fall cleanly. The slab punches through the supporting column in a failure mode. Engineers call punching shear. The column literally punches upward through the slab like a fist through cardboard. Once one column slab connection fails, the loads redistribute to adjacent columns, overloading them instantly. They fail. The failure propagates across the entire floor in seconds. Witnesses on nearby properties described the collapse as surreal, almost graceful. The building didn't explode. It settled. Each floor pancaked onto the one below in a progressive collapse that looked almost deliberate, as if the building was carefully lowering itself to the ground. The entire sequence from first failure to complete collapse took approximately 15 seconds. 5 men were on the 3rd floor when it failed. 3 were concrete finishers working on punch list items. 2 were carpenters removing the shores. Jorge Ferrer, age 43, married with 3 children, 22 years in construction. Ramon Ramos, age 37, married with 4 children, 15 years in construction. Arnaldo Martinez, age 29, single, 7 years in construction. Jose Perez, age 51, married with 2 children, 30 years in construction. Frank Andrade, age 28, married with 1 child, 6 years in construction. None of them had time to run. The 3rd floor slab failed beneath their feet, dropping them into the collapsing structure. The 4th and 5th floor slabs pancaked down on top of them. They were crushed instantly under hundreds of tons of concrete and steel. But the real story wasn't how they died, it was why. And what investigators would find in the weeks ahead would reveal something far more disturbing than a single construction accident. They would discover that Harbor Cay wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom. More on that shortly. The dust cloud that erupted from the collapse site was visible for miles, a brown-grey plume that rose several stories into the perfect Miami afternoon sky. Workers on adjacent sites stopped and stared. Traffic on South Bayshore Drive slowed. Within minutes, police and fire units were responding to what they initially thought might be a terrorist bombing. This was 1981, and the memory of the FALN attacks in New York was still fresh. But when first responders arrived, they found not a bombing, but something worse. A construction site that had simply ceased to exist. 5 stories of concrete structure compressed into approximately 12 feet of rubble. Exposed rebar jutted from the wreckage like broken bones. Dust still hung in the air. And somewhere in that mass of shattered concrete were 5 men. The rescue effort began immediately, though everyone on scene understood it was almost certainly a recovery operation, not a rescue. The weight of the collapsed structure made survival virtually impossible. Still, Miami Fire Rescue brought in their collapse rescue specialists, and the agonizing work of moving concrete piece by piece began. The first body was recovered at 7:30 p.m., 4 hours after the collapse. The last wasn't recovered until early morning on March 6th. None of the 5 men had survived even minutes. The crushing force of the pancaking floors had killed them all, instantly. The investigation began while rescue workers were still pulling bodies from the rubble. Metro-Dade County building inspectors arrived within hours. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration sent investigators from their regional office. The structural engineering firm that designed the building sent representatives. And the insurance companies. Oh, the insurance companies sent everyone. What they found was damning, not because it revealed criminal negligence, but because it revealed how routinely construction safety was compromised in the name of schedule and budget. and what they were about to uncover would shake the entire construction industry. But first, they had to understand exactly what had failed and why. The investigation discovered that shore removal had been performed early on multiple occasions during the Harbor Cay construction. The third-floor shores had been pulled early. The second-floor shores had been pulled early. It had become standard practice on this job site, and nobody had stopped it. More disturbingly, investigators found that this practice wasn't unique to Harbor Cay. Interviews with construction workers across South Florida revealed that early shore removal was common, perhaps even standard practice in the industry. The engineering plans said one thing, the actual construction practice said another, and the gap between them had been killing people for years, just in smaller numbers that didn't make headlines. The structural analysis was unambiguous. Testing of concrete samples from the fifth-floor slab revealed compressive strength of approximately 2,300 pounds per square inch at the time of collapse. Only 77% of the required 3,000 psi. The slab couldn't carry the loads being placed on it. Computer modeling of the structure showed that with shores in place as designed, the building would have easily supported construction loads. Without those shores, with an uncured fifth-floor slab and a partially cured third-floor slab carrying multiple floors' weight, failure was inevitable, not possible, inevitable. The only question was when, not if. The engineer who performed the forensic analysis, Dr. Robert Barnoff of the University of Miami, put it bluntly in his report. This building was designed correctly. It was built incorrectly. The design was safe. The construction practice was not. The failure was not a mystery. It was mathematics. But understanding why the mathematics weren't followed requires understanding the economic pressures of construction in 1981. Miami. And those pressures would lead to a criminal trial that would ask an uncomfortable question. If everyone in the industry is doing it, who's really the criminal? We'll get to that courtroom drama soon. The South Florida construction boom of the late 1970s and early 80s created intense competition and pressure. Developers demanded fast construction. Contractors bid low to win jobs, then cut corners to maintain profit margins. Crane rental costs ran $5,000 to $8,000 per day. Every day of delay cost money. Every hour of waiting for concrete to cure was an hour of lost productivity. The calculation was simple and brutal. Pull the shores early. Save 3 days of crane time, save $15,000 to $20,000. The risk of collapse seemed theoretical. After all, it had worked before. It had worked on this very building. This is the insidious nature of systemic failures. They work until they don't. Every successful shortcut reinforces the belief that the shortcut is safe. Every near miss that doesn't result in collapse becomes evidence that the engineers are too conservative, that the safety margins are unnecessarily large, that experience matters more than calculations. The workers removing shores on March 5th weren't stupid or malicious. They were following orders from supervisors who were following directions from project managers who were responding to pressure from owners who were trying to meet deadlines dictated by financing agreements. The system was designed to incentivize risk-taking, and the system worked exactly as designed, until 5 men died. 5 men. The legal aftermath was complex and protracted. Multiple lawsuits were filed. The families of the 5 dead workers sued the general contractor, the structural engineer, the concrete contractor, the owner, and virtually everyone else connected to the project. The cases took years to resolve. William Trempa, the construction superintendent, became the public face of the tragedy. He was charged with 5 counts of manslaughter, accused of recklessly ordering shore removal before the concrete had cured. The criminal case proceeded through the courts while the civil cases simultaneously moved forward. The criminal trial, which began in 1983, revealed the depth of the systemic problems. Defense attorneys argued that Trempa was following industry standard practice, that early shore removal was so common that criminalizing it would require prosecuting half the construction supervisors in South Florida. Prosecutors argued that common practice doesn't excuse reckless endangerment, that 5 men were dead because someone decided schedule mattered more than safety. And this is where the trial became fascinating, because the jury had to decide whether doing what everyone else does makes you a criminal. The testimony would reveal just how widespread this practice was, and how many other construction sites were potential Harbor Cays waiting to happen. The jury struggled. After 3 weeks of testimony and 4 days of deliberation, they convicted Trempa on 2 counts of manslaughter and acquitted him on 3. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, reduced to 3 years on appeal. He served 18 months before being released on parole. But the real question wasn't whether one superintendent should go to prison. The real question was whether the industry would change. The answer was yes, but slowly and incompletely. And the pattern that would emerge over the next 4 decades reveals something uncomfortable about how we learn safety lessons, or fail to learn them. The American Concrete Institute revised its guidelines for formwork and shoring in 1982, explicitly addressing the Harbor Cay collapse. The new standards required that shores not be removed until concrete reached specified strength, and that strength be verified by testing, not estimated by elapsed time. OSHA issued new regulations requiring written shoring plans, strength testing before shore removal, and competent person oversight of all formwork operations. The penalties for violations increased dramatically. Florida updated its building code, adding specific requirements for post-tensioned construction and shoring removal procedures. Other states followed with similar revisions. But enforcement remained inconsistent. Building inspectors couldn't be on every job site every day. The economic pressures that incentivized shortcuts didn't disappear. And the fundamental tension between engineering conservatism and construction practicality persisted. The civil lawsuits settled for amounts that were never publicly disclosed, but were reported to total over $20 million collectively. Enormous money in early 1980s dollars. The settlements were paid primarily by insurance companies, which meant that future insurance premiums for construction projects increased, which meant that construction costs overall increased, which meant that pressure to cut costs in other areas increased. The cycle continued. The deeper legacy of Harbor Cay wasn't in regulations or lawsuits. It was in the consciousness of the construction industry. The collapse became a case study in engineering schools, a cautionary tale in safety training, and a shorthand reference in construction site conversations. Remember Harbor Cay became a phrase that meant, don't take that shortcut, don't rush that process, don't assume it'll be fine because it was fine last time. But collective memory is short. By the late 1980s, a new generation of construction workers who hadn't been in the industry when Harbor Cay collapsed were entering the field. The lessons had to be relearned. And they were relearned through additional collapses. This is where the story gets uncomfortable, because what happened after Harbor Cay proves that 5 deaths weren't enough to change the system. In 2000, a parking garage under construction in Jacksonville, Florida, collapsed due to premature shore removal, killing one worker. In 2004, a condominium in Fort Lauderdale partially collapsed during construction, again due to inadequate shoring, injuring 6. In 2009, a hospital addition in Miami collapsed during concrete pouring, killing 3. Each collapse prompted renewed calls for better enforcement, better training, better safety culture. Each collapse resulted in investigations that found the same root causes Harbor Cay had revealed decades earlier: economic pressure, schedule demands, inadequate oversight, and the persistent belief that experience could substitute for engineering calculations. The technical lessons from Harbor Cay were straightforward. Concrete needs time to cure. Post-tensioned slabs are vulnerable before stressing. Shoring plans are engineered documents, not suggestions. Strength testing is mandatory, not optional. These aren't complex concepts, but implementing them consistently requires something harder than technical knowledge. It requires a cultural commitment to prioritizing safety over schedule. That commitment exists unevenly across the construction industry. Some companies maintain rigorous safety standards, treating shoring plans as inviolable and testing concrete strength religiously before shore removal. They take longer to build. They cost more. They don't have collapses. Other companies cut corners, pressure supervisors to move faster, and operate on the assumption that the engineering margins are conservative enough to tolerate some deviation. They build faster. They cost less. Sometimes they have collapses. The families of the 5 men who died at Harbor Cay became reluctant advocates for construction safety reform. Maria Ferrer, Jorge's widow, testified before the Florida legislature in 1983, urging stronger enforcement of construction regulations. Her testimony was emotional and effective, helping to pass legislation that increased penalties for safety violations and mandated more frequent inspections on large construction projects. But she also acknowledged the limits of regulation. You can write all the rules you want, she told legislators. But if the man on the job site believes his paycheck depends on working fast, and the man above him believes his promotion depends on finishing on schedule, and the man above him believes his profit depends on cutting costs, then all your rules don't matter. The culture has to change too. The culture did change somewhat. By the 2000s, construction safety had become a prominent concern in the industry. Major contractors employed full-time safety officers. Insurance companies required safety programs. OSHA inspections became more frequent and more serious. The death rate in construction declined significantly from the 1980s to the 2000 teens. But construction remains one of the most dangerous industries in America. According to Bureau of Labor Statistics data, construction accounts for approximately 20% of all workplace fatalities, despite representing only 7% of the workforce. Falls, struck by accidents, electrocutions, and caught between accidents, the fatal 4 in OSHA terminology, continue to kill hundreds of workers annually. And periodically, a building collapses during construction. The specific failures vary: inadequate shoring, design errors, material defects, construction defects. But the root causes remain recognizable to anyone who studied Harbor Cay. Schedule pressure, cost pressure. The belief that this time will be different. The conviction that experience matters more than calculations. Now here's what makes this story truly disturbing. The investigation into Harbor Cay revealed layers of failure that extended far beyond the immediate decision to remove shores prematurely. And understanding these layers explains why the same mistakes keep happening. Let's dig into the economics. The structural drawings for Harbor Cay, prepared by James Batista and Associates, were comprehensive and professional. They specified concrete strength, reinforcement details, post-tensioning tendon layout, and shoring requirements. The shoring plan, developed by the formwork contractor, showed exactly which shores could be removed when, based on concrete strength testing results. On paper, the project was engineered to be completely safe, but construction drawings exist in an idealized world. They assume perfect conditions. They assume materials arrive on schedule. They assume weather cooperates. They assume adequate labor is available. They assume no conflicts between systems. They assume everyone follows the plans exactly as drawn. Reality is messier. The concrete supplier might deliver a mix that's slightly off specification. The rebar might not be positioned perfectly. The formwork might have small deflections. The temperature might be lower than expected, slowing concrete curing. The crew might be short-handed. The crane might have mechanical issues. And the schedule might have already slipped due to weather delays 2 weeks earlier. Construction superintendents navigate this gap between ideal and real every day. Their job is to build the project safely, on time, and on budget. 3 goals that frequently conflict. When they do, something has to give. At Harbor Cay, safety gave. The economic model of construction incentivizes this choice. General contractors typically bid projects competitively, winning work by being the lowest qualified bidder. This creates immediate pressure to minimize costs. The profit margin on a typical commercial construction project might be 5 to 10% of the contract value. Any cost overrun eats directly into that margin. A project that runs over budget by 10% turns profitable work into break-even or loss-making work. The superintendent's performance is evaluated largely on schedule and budget adherence. Finishing on time looks good on performance reviews. Finishing under budget looks even better. Finishing with perfect safety but 2 months late and 20% over budget ends careers. This creates what engineers call a moral hazard, a situation where the incentive structure encourages risky behavior. The superintendent who pulls shores early and completes the project on schedule gets praise and promotion. The superintendent who insists on following the engineering specifications exactly, causing schedule delays, gets criticism and might lose their job to someone more practical. At Harbor Cay, the practical choice killed 5 people. And what investigators discovered about the concrete testing would reveal just how preventable those deaths were. The failure to stress the post-tensioning tendons before removing shores wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate sequence decision. Post-tensioning is typically performed by specialized subcontractors who operate on their own schedules. Coordinating their work with the general construction sequence requires planning. If the post-tensioning crew isn't available when needed, the general contractor faces a choice: wait for them, delaying the entire project, or proceed without stressing, accepting some additional risk. At Harbor Cay, they proceeded. The 3rd floor tendons hadn't been stressed when the shores were removed. The slab was carrying loads as unstressed concrete with holes running through it, dramatically weaker than the stressed condition the engineers had designed for. Combined with the freshly poured, uncured 5th floor above, the loading exceeded the slab's capacity by a significant margin. The engineering calculations, reconstructed after the collapse, showed just how significant. The third-floor slab, in its unstressed condition, with the loads from the floors above, was experiencing stresses approximately 230% of its design capacity, not 110%, a marginal overload that might have survived. Not even 150%, a serious overload that might have caused cracking but not collapse. 230%, more than double the design capacity. The structure held for hours under this overload, which is actually remarkable. Concrete has reserve capacity beyond its design limits. The safety factors engineers build into calculations mean that exceeding the design load doesn't cause immediate failure. But reserve capacity is finite. Microscopic cracks form and propagate. The internal structure of the concrete gradually breaks down. Eventually, catastrophically, it fails. At 3:15 p.m., it failed. The specific trigger for the collapse was likely a punching shear failure at one of the interior columns, probably near the center of the slab where the bending stresses were highest. Punching shear is an insidious failure mode. It gives little warning. The slab appears fine, then suddenly the column punches through the slab like a fist through a ceiling tile. Once one column fails, the loads redistribute instantly to adjacent columns, overloading them beyond their capacity. They fail. The failure propagates across the entire floor in a cascading pattern that takes only seconds. Witnesses at adjacent construction sites describe the sound as unforgettable. Not a single loud bang like an explosion, but a series of deep, resonant booms as each floor collapsed onto the one below. Some described it as sounding like thunder, if thunder came from the ground instead of the sky. Others described it as sounding like a giant was walking on the building, each footstep crushing another floor. The dust cloud that rose from the collapse site was visible for over an hour. It hung in the humid Miami air, a brown haze that coated everything within several hundred feet. Workers on nearby sites found their cars, tools, and lunchboxes covered with a fine powder, the pulverized remains of Harbor Cay. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Construction workers from adjacent sites rushed to Harbor Cay, thinking they might be able to help with rescue efforts. What they found was incomprehensible. A 5-story building compressed into a pile barely higher than a single story, with exposed rebar, shattered formwork, and dust still settling. Some workers began climbing onto the rubble, trying to move pieces of concrete by hand, but were quickly ordered back by the first fire department units arriving on scene. Miami, Fire Rescue's collapse rescue protocol, was still relatively new. In 1981, the systematic approach to collapse structure rescue, now standard across the country, was just being developed, but the fundamentals were understood. Stabilize the wreckage to prevent secondary collapse, locate victims using search dogs and listening devices, and carefully remove debris piece by piece. The challenge at Harbor Cay was the sheer mass of material. Hundreds of tons of concrete slabs had collapsed, creating a debris field, with pieces ranging from fist-sized chunks to massive slab sections weighing several tons. Moving this material required heavy equipment, cranes, excavators, concrete saws, but using heavy equipment near where victims might be trapped risked causing further collapse or crushing survivors. The decision was made to use hand tools for the initial search phase, with heavy equipment standing by, Rescue workers formed lines, passing concrete chunks hand to hand, working inward from the edges of the collapse zone. It was exhausting, frustrating work. For every cubic yard of material removed, it seemed like 2 cubic yards remained, and everyone knew that with each passing hour, the chances of finding anyone alive diminished. The first body was located at 7:30 p.m. by a search dog trained to detect human scent. The victim was trapped under a section of collapsed slab, crushed immediately when the floors pancaked. Recovery required cutting through reinforcing steel with oxyacetylene torches and carefully lifting the concrete section with a crane. The process took nearly an hour. 4 more victims remained in the wreckage. The recovery operation continued through the night under portable lights. The temperature dropped into the 60s, cool for Miami, and a light drizzle began around midnight, making the rubble slippery and the work even more difficult. But the operation continued. The families of the missing workers had gathered at the site, held back behind police barriers, waiting for news that everyone knew would be terrible. The last body was recovered at 4:30 a.m. on March 6th, 13 hours after the collapse. All 5 victims had been found within a relatively small area of the 3rd floor, suggesting they had been working near each other when the failure occurred. None had survived even minutes. The medical examiner's reports would later confirm that all 5 died of massive traumatic injuries, the clinical term for being crushed by hundreds of tons of falling concrete. The next phase of the investigation focused on the question that everyone was asking: who knew and when did they know it? And what investigators uncovered would reveal a truth that nobody wanted to hear. Multiple workers interviewed by OSHA investigators admitted that early shore removal was common practice, not just at Harbor Cay, but across the industry. One carpenter, who requested anonymity, told investigators, "Everybody does it. You pour on Friday, you pull shores on Monday, you don't wait 3 days. Nobody waits 3 days. You'd never finish any building if you waited 3 days every time." Another worker was more blunt. "The engineer who designed this building has probably never been on a construction site. He doesn't understand how things actually work. We know concrete. We can tell when it's strong enough. We don't need to wait for some test." This attitude, the conviction that experienced construction workers could judge concrete strength by eye or by tapping on it with a hammer, was widespread. And to be fair, it had worked most of the time. Experienced finishers could often estimate concrete strength reasonably well under typical conditions. The problem was that most of the time, and reasonably well, weren't the same as always and accurately. The margin for error was too small, the consequences of misjudgment too severe. The concrete testing records at Harbor Cay told the story that should have prevented everything. Test cylinders had been made when the 5th floor was poured, standard practice to monitor strength gain. But those cylinders hadn't been tested before the shores were removed. They were tested afterward, as part of the investigation. They showed compressive strength of 2,300 pounds per square inch, well below the 3,000 psi required before shore removal. Had anyone tested those cylinders before pulling the shores, the collapse would never have happened. The test results would have shown insufficient strength, and the shores would have remained in place. 5 men would have gone home to their families that evening. But testing takes time. The cylinders have to be transported to a testing lab. The lab has to crush them in a compression machine and report results. The process takes hours, sometimes a full day. And during that time, construction stands still, the crane sits idle, workers wait, and money burns. The economic calculation was simple. Spend 8 hours waiting for test results, or trust experience and keep working. The fact that trusting experience had worked before made the decision seem reasonable. The fact that the one time it didn't work, killed 5 people, revealed the fatal flaw in that reasoning. The regulatory response to Harbor Cay focused heavily on testing requirements. The revised ACI guidelines and OSHA regulations both emphasized that shore removal must be based on actual strength testing, not elapsed time or visual inspection. The requirement seemed obvious in hindsight. How could anyone justify removing structural support without verifying the concrete could carry the loads? But before Harbor Cay, many contractors considered testing an unnecessary formality, a paper-shuffling requirement that didn't reflect real-world practice. Harbor Cay changed that perception. Testing became standard. The ACI published detailed guidelines on cylinder preparation, curing, and testing procedures. Testing labs proliferated. Field testing equipment became more common, allowing on-site strength verification. And crucially, the culture began to shift toward accepting that testing delays were a necessary cost of safe construction. But culture changes slowly and unevenly. While major contractors adopted rigorous testing protocols, smaller firms, especially, those working on competitively bid projects with tight margins, sometimes still cut corners. OSHA inspection data from the 1990s showed continued violations of shoring requirements, typically justified by the same reasoning that had led to Harbor Cay: schedule pressure, cost pressure, and the conviction that experienced workers knew better than engineers. Now let's talk about what happened to the families. Because behind every lawsuit, every settlement check, every insurance payment were 5 families whose lives were shattered in 15 seconds. And their stories reveal why Harbor Cay matters beyond the technical details. Jorge Ferrer left behind a wife and 3 children, ages 14, 11, and 8. He had worked construction since arriving in Miami from Cuba 22 years earlier, saving enough to buy a small house in Hialeah. His oldest daughter was planning to attend college, the first in the family. The civil settlement from Harbor Cay paid for that education, but it couldn't pay for a father walking her down the aisle 5 years later. Ramon Ramos had 4 children, ages 16, 13, 9, and 6. He had been promoted to foreman 6 months before the collapse, finally earning enough to move his family out of a rental apartment into a home. The settlement money couldn't replace their father, but it ensured the children didn't lose their home. His widow never remarried. She said no one could replace Ramon. Arnaldo Martinez, at 29, was the youngest victim. He was single, sending money each month to his parents in Nicaragua. He had plans to return home, start a business, maybe get married. Those plans died at 3:15 p.m. on March 5th. His mother never recovered from the loss. She died 3 years later. Friends said she died of a broken heart. Perez, at 51, was the oldest. 30 years in construction had taken a toll on his body. Bad knees, bad back, hearing loss from years of working around loud equipment. He was planning to retire in a few years, maybe do some fishing, spend time with his grandchildren. He never got the chance. Frank Andrade had a 1-year-old son who would never remember his father. His wife was 26, suddenly a widow with a baby to raise alone. The settlement provided financial stability, but it couldn't provide the life they had planned. That 1-year-old boy is now 43 years old. He grew up without a father because someone decided 3 days was too long to wait. These weren't statistics. They were people. They had families, plans, futures. They went to work on a Thursday afternoon and never came home, because someone made a calculation that their safety was worth less than 3 days of schedule. The Harbor Cay site sat vacant for years after the collapse. The developer declared bankruptcy. The property went through a foreclosure. Eventually, it was purchased by a new developer who built a different project, completing it without incident in 1987. Today, luxury condominiums occupy the waterfront property where 5 men died in 1981. Most residents probably don't know the history. There's no memorial, no plaque, no indication that the ground beneath their expensive apartments was once a construction site that became a tomb. But construction workers know. And here's what they've learned, or more disturbingly, what they haven't learned. The lesson of Harbor Cay isn't that construction is impossible to do safely. Modern projects routinely build structures far more complex than Harbor Cay without incident. The lesson is that safety requires vigilance, that engineering specifications aren't suggestions, and that the pressures to cut corners are constant and insidious. 4 decades later, construction is safer than it was in 1981. The death rate has declined. The regulations are stronger. The testing is more rigorous. The culture has shifted somewhat toward prioritizing safety. But construction workers still die. Buildings still collapse occasionally during construction. The economic pressures that create incentives for shortcuts remain, and the fundamental tension between safety and schedule, between engineering specifications and practical reality, persists. In June 2021, 40 years after Harbor Cay, a 12-story condominium building in Surfside, Florida, just miles from the Harbor Cay site, collapsed in the middle of the night, killing 98 people. Not during construction. After decades of use, a different failure mode, different causes, but the same underlying issue. Maintenance and repairs that should have been done weren't done because they were expensive and inconvenient. The pattern persists. The details change, the names change, but the fundamental calculation remains the same. Safety versus cost, engineering versus convenience, what should be done versus what's profitable to do. Harbor Cay stands as a reminder that the margin for error in construction is smaller than people assume. That experience doesn't trump engineering. That shortcuts work until they don't, and that when they don't work, people die. The 5 men who died didn't make the decision that killed them. They were following orders, doing their jobs, trusting that the people above them had ensured their safety. That trust was misplaced. The decision to remove shores prematurely was made by someone who believed schedule mattered more than the engineering specifications, who thought 3 days of savings justified the risk, who had gotten away with it before and expected to get away with it again. The calculations were available, the engineering was sound, the safe procedure was documented, but the safe procedure was inconvenient. It cost money. it took time. And in the calculus of construction economics in 1981 Miami, those considerations outweighed 5 human lives. Until 3:15 p.m. on March 5th, when the mathematics caught up with the shortcuts, and 5 men vanished in 15 seconds of falling concrete. The industry learned. Then it forgot. Then it relearned through more collapses, more deaths, more families destroyed. The cycle continues because the economic incentives that created Harbor Cay never went away. They just got better at hiding. The names are worth repeating. Jorge Ferrer, Ramon Ramos, Arnaldo Martinez, Jose Perez, Frank Andrade, 5 men who went to work on a Thursday afternoon in March and never came home. 5 men who died not from an act of God or an unforeseeable accident, but from a decision. A shortcut that everyone took, because everyone always did. Until the building remembered what the builders had forgotten. Concrete needs time to cure, loads need to be supported, and engineering specifications are written in the blood of previous tragedies. Harbor Cay added 5 more names to that ledger. The question, 4 decades later, is whether those names meant enough to prevent the next 5. The answer, based on continued collapses and continued deaths, appears to be no. The lesson keeps being taught. The industry keeps failing to learn it. Because somewhere right now, on a construction site in America, someone is looking at a shoring plan that says, wait 3 days. And they're thinking about the crane rental cost, and the weather forecast, and the schedule, and the fact that it worked last time. And they're making a calculation. Safety versus schedule, engineering versus economics, 3 days versus 15 seconds. They saved a day. Harbor Cay lost 5 lives. The mathematics were clear. The choice was conscious. The consequences were inevitable. Remember their names: Jorge Ferrer, Ramon Ramos, Arnaldo Martinez, Jose Perez, Frank Andrade. They died because someone decided waiting 3 days was too expensive.